My name is Jan Heide. I'm a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am enormously honored to have been selected as an AMA Fellow, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about some of my work. Let me go about this in the following way. Let me start by talking about what I do and how it began, to steal a line from Neil Diamond. From that, I would like to talk about some specific themes in my work and close with a few thank yous. The general focus of my work is on marketing organization. Specifically, I'm interested in how firms organize their value chain relationships, either with upstream suppliers or with downstream resellers and distributors. And the general idea that has driven much of my work is that relationship management is a key part of a marketer's toolkit. And for me, this began with an extraordinary doctoral seminar at the University of Wisconsin on marketing channels taught by George John back in the fall of 1983. And what followed from that was my dissertation, which I wrote under George's supervision, which sought to explain closeness between suppliers and buyers. In terms of the themes in my work, the lens that I've been relying on since the beginning has been the so-called new institutional economics, in particular, the transaction cost economics, or TCE branch. The original premise of TCE, perhaps as most commonly associated with Oliver Williamson and his 1975 book, is to explain choices among institutional forms. And Williamson framed this originally as a choice between a market versus a hierarchy. And this premise was clearly relevant and important to marketing. For instance, how should a firm organize its selling function? Should it go to market with a company sales force or rely on external distributors or manufacturers' reps? As important as that premise was, it also possessed limitations, given the observation that much economic activity takes place in the middle, between markets and hierarchies, through partnerships, alliances, and hybrids of various kinds. So a literature emerged in various branches of the social sciences on intermediate governance forms. Sociologists did work on contracts which contained hierarchical elements. Arthur Stinchcombe talked about contracts between firms that contain rules, monitoring provisions, incentive clauses, that looked a lot like hierarchical relationships, but that were written and were used to regulate relationships across organizational boundaries. Legal scholars worked on so-called relational contracts between firms. Stuart Macaulay, Ian McNeill talked about so-called unique relational contracting norms that could be used to manage ongoing relationships. Now, interestingly, both of these accounts described a shift away from using the market, but they involve very different types of shifts. And I tried to develop that idea in an article in the Journal of Marketing back in 1994. My conjecture at the time was that understanding these shifts required focusing on specific governance mechanisms and their properties. Some mechanisms could be described as being formal, such as contracts. Others are informal, like social norms. And that raised some very interesting questions about how different governance mechanisms relate to each other. And I explored that question for quite some time in a series of different papers. One question had to do with whether formal and informal mechanisms are substitutes for each other. If I have informal norms, do I need a contract? And does one mechanism, a formal mechanism, perhaps crowd out or do damage to informal ones? If I have social norms and introduce a formal contract, may that actually damage or undermine the norms? And finally, are there complementarities between formal and informal mechanisms? May perhaps norms fill gaps in formal contracts? And this, to me, was a very interesting line of work, which kept me busy for quite a number of years. Another line of work that intrigued me was the so-called Plural Forms thesis. Once the literature started thinking about governance mechanisms, that marked a departure from the original TCE thesis about institutional form, the whole issue of choosing a market versus a hierarchy. That being said, it became clear to me that institutional form actually matters, because firms make decisions in practice both on whether to outsource in the first place and on how to manage an outsourced relationship once that decision has been made. That being said, firms do not necessarily engage in discrete choice. They don't necessarily make or buy. Firms sometimes make and buy simultaneously. A manufacturer may make a component in-house and rely on external suppliers. And a company may rely on omni-channels downstream using combinations of direct sales, company-owned retail stores, and independent distributors. And this plural forms thesis raised interesting questions in its own right. What happens when you combine different forms in parallel? What happens when a company makes and buys simultaneously? One scenario is that you get important spillovers. One governance form, like an internal branch, can be used to discipline or serve as a check on an external governance branch. And theoretically, that suggested that individual transactions are linked. Furthermore, from a theoretical standpoint, this suggested that we needed to study larger networks and not only focus on individual transactions. My most recent line of work involves so-called temporary organizations. And if you look back at the standard TCE literature and the standard body of TCE research, it points to the roles of firms and intermediate governance forms or arrangements like long-term partnerships. At the same time, a lot of marketing activity and economic activity in general takes place outside of formal organizations and long-term relationships in the context of projects or temporary organizations. You see these temporary structures in new product development, you see them in advertising, you see them in construction, where a group of specialists come together on a temporary basis to solve a certain problem. Theoretically, projects represent challenges in part because of their time dimension. Many projects lack a history. They lack a history. The parties have not worked together before. And it may also lack a future because the parties may not expect to interact again on a future project. That means that from a governance standpoint, a project requires unique mechanisms that can be deployed and take effect under time compression. And this, to me, is an enormously interesting line of work. It poses some really interesting questions that I think poses or represents some really unique opportunities. Let me close with a few thank yous. I would like to thank the AMA who has made this fellowship available. I would also like to thank the group that nominated me. I am so appreciative of the initiative and the work that you put into this. I would also like to thank the Weatherhead School at Case Western Reserve, who gave me some incredible opportunities early on in my career, and the marketing group there, to me, represents family. the University of Wisconsin, who in a weak moment hired me back. I would like to extend my appreciation. They've been enormously supportive to me for a number of years, and that means a great deal to me. I would also like to thank the schools that have hosted me over the years. The Norwegian School of Management, BI, my alma mater, Cambridge Judge Business School, and the University of Melbourne. I really, really appreciate all the support that you've given me. George John, I mentioned initially, I'm enormously appreciative for his initial and ongoing support. His imprint is there in all of my work, and I'm very, very cognizant of that. I would also like to thank my co-authors. They are too numerous to mention, but they have supported me, encouraged me, covered for me, and taught me more than they will ever know. I would also like to thank my doctoral students. There are too many to mention, but I would like to single out Rod Stump, Debbie Mishra, Ken Vatne, Alok Kumar, Elham Ghazimatin, and Ali Shamsolai. Elham and Ali, I was not their main advisors, but I will claim a small piece of them. And using the same logic, I would also like to claim a small piece of Eric Reinflesch. Working with you has been a true joy. And my good friend Mike Houston once said that sometimes things go right in the educational process when the advisor learns more than the student. And that has been the case with these collaborations. I would also like to thank my family for putting up with a lot of long weekends and for being an incredible source of support in every way possible. Thank you all very much.